Hacer abete perro begerto. Yeta perro begelo que comin. Vai carnish beaderto. Yirs beabegelo que comin. Genesh hacho hatarota arushanoto. Benki.
Shalom, shalom, brothers and sisters, Brother Arya. And we're reading again from it's part 2, from the scribal schools, the scribal education in ancient Israel, the Old Hebrew epigraphic evidence. Right, and so this is part 2. I said I was going to read to you guys the rest of, well, not the rest, but most of where we left off at. We're going to read this right here, diachronic development and synchronic consistency. So we're going to read this, a couple pages out of this part 2. Maybe a part 3, I'm not sure. Weeks has conceded that if there were consistency in the Old Hebrew orthographic system, there would be some force in this argument that schooling must be hypothesized. However, he states that the use of matres lectionis is far from consistent. Based on the existing epigraphic evidence, I would argue that the Old Hebrew epigraphic data reflects synchronic consistency and diachronic development. The Old Hebrew orthographic system can be synthesized as follows. During the 9th and early 8th centuries, Hebrew orthography employed a system of final matres lectionis. So in the 8th century and 9th century, the vowels were at the end of the words. Final I was represented by Yod. Final U was represented by a Wav. Final A, long A, was represented by a Hey. Final long E was represented by a Hey. And final long O was represented by a Hey. So you had 3 vowels that were represented by a Hey, right? All those talking about Hebrew didn't have no vowels. They haven't done no research, man. Right? There is a general absence of the internal matres lectionis throughout the lion's share of the 8th century. Right, so all during the 700s BC, there was no internal; it was outternal. During the terminal period of the 8th century and the beginning of the 7th century, final matres lectionis continued to be used, with final long I represented by Yod, final long U represented by Wab, and final long A represented by Hey, final long E represented by Hey, final long O represented by Hey. In addition, there is Old Hebrew evidence for incipient uses of internal matres lectionis, with Wav serving as matres lectionis for internal U, and Yod serving as matres lectionis for internal I. During the second half of the 7th century and the beginning of the 6th century, final matres lectionis continued to be used, with final I represented by Yod, final U represented by Wav, final long A represented by Hey, final E represented by Hey, and final O represented by Hey. So those things never changed. In addition, there is growing usage of internal matres lectionis, with Wav serving as a matres lectionis for internal U, Yod serving as matres lectionis for internal I. Finally, I would argue that certain additional structures regarding usage within Old Hebrew are also of some import. For example, although he could serve as the Hey could serve as a matres lectionis for final E and final O, it was never used as an internal matres lectionis in Old Hebrew for any vowel. Moreover, although medial I and U could be, which is short, could be marked with a Yod and a Wav, medial A was never marked with a matres lectionis, not even with Hey. So they used the olive, I guess, for the A. In some, Phoenician, Aramaic, and Hebrew reflect different orthographies. Therefore, there were orthographic options for those using the same 22-letter alphabet. Furthermore, although there is development of orthographic conventions in Old Hebrew, there is also marked consistency of usage and non-usage of final and internal matres lectionis. This sort of standardization is most consistent with a strong mandating mechanism. Alright, dialectal differences in Old Hebrew. 2 dialects of Hebrew are attested in Old Hebrew inscriptions: Northern, which is Israelite, and Southern, which is Judean. For example, within the Southern dialect is reflected in Biblical Hebrew. The word for year is SNH, Sanah. Significantly, the Northern dialect is consistent with using ST or STT, which is probably where they get Shabbat, or not Shabbat, but for year. And let's see here. Moreover, within the Southern dialect, diphthongs do not contract. However, within the Northern dialect, diphthongs do contract. Thus, within the Southern dialect, the word for wine is spelled YYN or yan. But in the Northern dialect, the diphthong has contracted and the word is spelled YN, yin. Moreover, within the Southern dialect, the diphthong R has not contracted. For example, the word Hamasa, the source is spelled HMWS or Che Mem Wav Shin, Sodom Tunnel line 5. And the word Ba'ad, while yet, is spelled Bet Yod Wav Dalit. That is, the diphthong R is not contracted. Although the evidence is modest, it has been argued that this diphthong does contract in Northern Israelite. To be sure, two dialects of Hebrew are reflected in Old Hebrew epigraphic record, but random dialect violation does not occur. Rather, consistency is the norm. And you saw some of these when in the Torah when the Israelites said had the ones that were saying to be Israel say Sheboleth, and they couldn't pronounce it right, and then they would kill them if they couldn't pronounce it right. And you see it, it's like different dialects, different pronunciations. You also see it with the Samaritan, how they talk right now with the compared to the biblical, etc. Egyptian, completed scribal conventions, heretical numerals. Egyptian heretic numerals are attested at several different Iron Age Israelite and Judean sites, spanning from the 9th to the early 6th centuries. For example, heretic numerals in Old Hebrew script are both present on an ostracon from Arad. Moreover, the Reisner Samara ostracon frequently use heretic numerals. Hieratic numerals are also attested for in Arad 9 and Arad 8. Several of the Arad 7 through 6 Hebrew ostracons use hieratic numerals and symbols, and one ostracon consists solely of hieratic numerals. Hieratic numerals were also found at Lachish, on Lachish weights, and also arguably at Masad Hashavyahu. The use of hieratic numerals in Kadesh Barnea is particularly significant because among the old Hebrew ostracon were several with hieratic numerals, including one which was an ostracon that originally consisted of hieratic numerical data spanning in numerical order from 1 to 10,000. This ostracon also contained at least the beginning of another similar listing of the numbers. Based on the epigraphic evidence, it is demonstrable that Israelite scribes during the course of 9th through 6th centuries at disparate sites in Israel and Judah were capable of using complicated foreign numeric systems. Because of the complexity of the hieratic system, developing proficiency in its writing would not have been facile. For this reason, I believe that it is convincing to argue that learning hieratic numerals reflects formal and standardized scribal training. So what is hieratic numerals? Let me just type this in. What is that? Hieratic numerals were a cursive shorthand version of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Used for everyday writing. Okay. So that's what that is, hieratic numerals. All right. So complementary notations, abracadaries and exercise tablets. Of course, abracadaries have been discovered at various sites in Israel and Judah, as well as in various other parts of the Levant, including Ugarit. It has often been argued that abracadaries are the product of an educational context. For example, Puig has affirmed that Il ne fait aucun doute que la plupart des abacadaires relevant de. However, Haran has argued that there is no necessary connection between many of the abacadaries in schools. Crenshaw, to be sure, Lemire has drawn some broad conclusions from the presence of abacadaries in various sites. The presence of an abacadary at a site was indicative of a school at that site. Okay. And he also considered certain brief fragmentary inscriptions to be probable abacadaries, even though these could be read as word fragments. For these reasons, he was subjected to criticism. Of course, some have actually suggested that abacadaries were perceived as having some sort of mantic function in ancient societies and were not educational. However, I am not convinced that all existing abacadaries functioned as talisman or were perceived as having mantic functions. Naturally, though, I would not argue that the presence of an abacadary at a site must necessarily be indicative of a school at the site. It might be indicative of the presence of a student at a site. Ultimately, I would simply affirm that it would be difficult to suggest that none of the abacadaries is to be associated with curricular activities. General context, epistolatory documents. Within the corpus of Old Hebrew inscriptions are a number of letters. These documents will normally begin with some reference to the recipient, often contain some sort of greeting. Example, may Yahweh cause my Lord to hear a message of peace and good things. Sometimes the name of the sender is also provided. But this is not a dominant component of Old Hebrew letters. Normally, Old Hebrew letters reflect a clear transition from the traditional greetings to the body of the letter. The word wa'et and now is a very common mode of transition, although sometimes different transitional formula can be used. After the transitional component of the letter, the body of the letter was penned, closing a formula. Example, signature, list of gods, and witnesses are not a traditional component of Old Hebrew letters. It would not be tenable to argue that learning the basic features of Old Hebrew epistolatory formula is a complex procedure. However, the presence of a certain common structure within the epistolatory corpus cannot be dismissed as being of no circular import. So what are his conclusions? His conclusion is right here. Old Hebrew scribes produced inscriptions that reflected meticulousness with regard to the morphological and stance and ductus as well. In addition, they produced inscriptions that reflect assiduousness with regard to the precise conventional spatial relationships of letters. Example, ayin and pei. The synchronic consistency is striking, especially in light of the fact that diachronic development is a feature of the Old Hebrew script. Also of significance is the fact that the Old Hebrew inscriptions can be distinguished from the Phoenician and Aramaic script series. That is, there are Old Hebrew inscription isographs. In sum, there is a national Old Hebrew script. It is standardized and reflects synchronic consistency in the face of diachronic development. And in addition, it differs markedly from the national Phoenician script and the national Aramaic script. Ultimately, I would contend that the precision, meticulousness, and consistency of Old Hebrew script and its marked consistent differences with the Phoenician and Aramaic are features that reflect formal, standardized scribal education. Such features are certainly not consistent with an absence of formal standardized education. Furthermore, the orthographic conventions of Old Hebrew also reflect synchronic consistency and diachronic development. Of course, some have supposed that the reason for orthographic consistency is that the 22-letter alphabet permitted no real orthographic options. However, comparative orthographic analysis, i.e., of Phoenician, Aramaic, and Old Hebrew, has demonstrated that there were indeed orthographic options. Thus, the consistency of Old Hebrew orthography cannot be dismissed. Rather, there must have been mechanisms present that accounts for the orthographic consistency, namely formal standardized education. In addition, numerous Old Hebrew inscriptions from the 9th through 6th centuries BCE and from Israelite and Judean sites contain hieratic numerals, a complicated numeric system. Such things were, I would argue, fundamentally circular foci in ancient Israel. Of course, some have argued that becoming proficient in an alphabetic writing system is facile, and so no formal education would be required. However, modern studies of the time required for proficiency in the alphabetic writing system demonstrate that learning an alphabetic system is not facile. Rather, substantial time is required even for the most gifted students. And I agree, when it comes to learning Hebrew, it takes time. It takes time. It is simply not feasible to attempt an account for Old Hebrew epigraphic data without positing some sort of formal standardized education. After all, the production of formal standardized and sophisticated epigraphs necessitates the presence of formally trained scribes. Finally, to complement this discussion, there should be some reference to the ages that arguably fostered and sustained the formal standardized education in the Old Hebrew writing system. That is, because of the nature and consistency of the Old Hebrew epigraphic evidence, it is cogent to posit that there must have been a significant and powerful mechanism that fostered and sustained education in Old Hebrew writing. In my opinion, the most reasonable position is that the state was the primary aegis for scribal education in Iron to Israel. After all, the royal administration was a powerful center for elite activity, and the tasks associated with the palace and temple would require literate personnel. Moreover, the majority of Old Hebrew epigraphs are administrative and military in nature. That is, economic dockets, military correspondence are among the most common. Some might counter that my supposition that scribal education was under the aegis of royal administration would necessitate the presence of excavated monumental building or component thereof, which could plausibly be identified as such. This does not necessarily follow. However, note the example that Assyriologists have suggested that even in Mesopotamia, much schooling occurred in domestic contexts. Moreover, Old Hebrew epigraphic materials, some of which contain the names of high officials, have been discovered in contexts that are arguably domestic. Example, the city of David, Boulay. One should therefore be careful before positing rigidly the necessity of some sort of monumental architectural feature which is discernible as the locus for Israelite scribal education. My own suspicion is that scribal education in Israel could have occurred in a variety of contexts, monumental and non-monumental, but always with trained scribal personnel at the helm. To be sure, the locus and the aegis will continue to be matters of debate, and I intend to address these issues in subsequent publications. However, the point of this article is to focus on epigraphic evidence and the fact that there is no tenable manner of accounting for the Old Hebrew epigraphic evidence without positing some kind of formal standardized education for scribal elites, regardless of the precise locus.
Waganish be a bikin robo, yish be a bikin long and coming. Genish a cajo and the rota ursonoto, when kinis at the romeganai.